From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. Our top story tonight, the United States President Joe Biden announced yesterday that American troops will end their combat duties in Iraq by the end of the year. He made the announcement during a White House meeting with Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi. Kadhimi is seen as an ally of the United States. He's tried to check the power of Iran-aligned fighter groups. But Kadhimi's government also condemned a U.S. air raid against Iran-allied fighters, calling it a violation of Iraqi sovereignty.
I thank you for all the blood and treasure the American has given for a free and democratic Iraq. Today, our relation is stronger than ever.
President Biden says relations with Iraq are in a new phase.
We support strengthening Iraq's democracy, and we're anxious to make sure the election goes forward in October. And we're also committed to our security cooperation, our shared fight against ISIS.
The president said that the new role for American troops in Iraq will be to train and help the country deal with ISIS. The U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003 under the leadership of former President George Bush Jr. This was on the pretext of eliminating non-existent weapons of mass destruction. Over 460,000 American military personnel were deployed after the invasion. The U.S. currently has about 3,500 troops in Iraq. 4 United States Democratic lawmakers are calling on the government to rein in the unfettered use of spyware. Representatives Tom Malinowski, Katie Porter, Joaquin Castro, and Anna Eshoo called for companies like the Israeli NSO Group to be shut down or sanctioned. This was after revelations last week that the NSO Group had engaged in high-level spying on heads of state, journalists, and human rights activists around the world. This discovery was made by the France-based watchdog group Forbidden Stories. Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz will be visiting France on Wednesday to discuss the scandal. Gantz's trip follows the report that French President Emmanuel Macron's phone was on a list of targets that was possibly under surveillance by Pegasus. Meanwhile, Pakistan is asking the United Nations to investigate India's use of Israeli spyware to hack into Prime Minister Imran Khan's phone. Israel's defense ministry oversees commercial exports of spyware and cyber surveillance of technologies like Pegasus. The much anticipated United States House investigation into the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol began today. Lawmakers heard from 4 police officers who tried to defend the U.S. Capitol during the riot. On January 6 this year, hundreds of supporters of the former U.S. President Donald Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol. This was in an attempt to interrupt the certification of Joe Biden as U.S. President. 5 deaths have been attributed to the attack. Benny Thompson, the Select Committee chair, asked the testifying officers to aid in formulating the committee's agenda. D.C. Metropolitan Police Officer Michael Faunan responded with a wish list. He wants an investigation of whether there was a collaboration between the politicians, their staff, and the rioters. Fanon said, "They tortured me. They beat me." The committee established by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi included 2 Republicans, Representative Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. Republicans are boycotting the proceedings after the Republican House leader Kevin McCarthy withdrew his nominees. Republicans had blocked an earlier effort to establish a bipartisan commission. This committee gives House Speaker Pelosi more control. Texas House Speaker Dade Phelan has issued an arrest warrant for a state Democrat who has fled to Washington, D.C. The warrant to apprehend State Representative Philip Cortez is the first signed by the Speaker. Over 50 Texas House Democrats left the state earlier this month. This was to deny quorum to Republicans from passing legislation restricting voting in the state. The current special session is planned to end August 6th. Democrats have said that they do not plan to return to the state before then. The group Powered by People, which was founded by former Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke, is helping Texas House Democrats. This includes providing monetary support of $600,000 for their stay in Washington, D.C. The money will be used to help offset costs for lodging, meals, and transportation for over 50 Democrats and about 24 staffers. Bloomberg is reporting that Chinese stocks listed in the United States stock market have lost $769 billion since February. The loss occurred after regulators in China unveiled an overhaul of its education sector. New rules ban private entities teaching school subjects from making profits. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission announced a restriction. A commissioner said that Chinese companies listed on the U.S. stock exchange must disclose the risks of the Chinese government interfering in their businesses. This will be a part of their regular reporting obligations. Thousands of Afghan families are fleeing their homes to escape fighting in the former Taliban bastion of Kandahar. The United Nations is warning that Afghanistan could see the highest number of civilian deaths in more than a decade. Pakistan has opened its borders with Afghanistan once again. Since 1979, Pakistan has taken in about 3 million Afghan refugees. Tajikistan says that it's ready to take in up to 100,000 Afghan refugees. US President Joe Biden has approved $100 million in emergency funds to resettle Afghan refugees. The US Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, has imposed new flight restrictions over Afghanistan for US airlines. This is in response to the changing security environment. Pakistan said on Monday that it's amicably repatriated dozens of Afghan soldiers and police personnel to authorities in Afghanistan a day after they had crossed the border. They were apparently fleeing advances by Taliban insurgents. Taliban attacks in recent weeks have escalated and forced hundreds of pro-Afghan government forces to take shelter in Tajikistan, Iran, China, and Pakistan. Mary Simon was sworn in Monday as Canada's 30th Governor General. She's the first Indigenous person to hold this position. Simon will serve as the representative of the country's head of state, Queen Elizabeth II. She's a former journalist, ambassador, and Inuit community advocate.
We are reminded daily that even though diversity is a core Canadian value, our country must do more to respect all languages, cultures, ethnicities, religions, and way of living. As Governor General, I will embody our nation's commitment to diversity and acceptance.
In her speech, Simon advocated defending the environment and reconciling with Indigenous peoples. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada needs people like Simon who will build bridges to bring the country together. Since May, hundreds of unmarked graves of Indigenous children have been discovered at former residential schools in Canada. Children were forcibly separated from their families and assimilated into Canada's European settler culture in these schools. They were also physically, sexually, and verbally abused. The schools were in operations up till the mid-1990s. Tunisian President Kais Saied continues to consolidate his power using the country's military. Saied ousted Prime Minister Hashim Mashishi and suspended the legislature for 30 days. Street clashes erupted yesterday around the army-barricaded parliament. Troops surrounded the officer of the Prime Minister. Mashishi later announced that he would hand power to the person chosen by the president. The president, who controls armed forces under the Constitution, warned his opponents against taking up arms. Saied threatened that a single bullet would be reciprocated by a rain of bullets. Said's dramatic move comes even though the Tunisian constitution enshrines a parliamentary democracy. Since Said was elected in 2019, he has been locked in a showdown with Mashishi and Rashid Ghanouchi. Ghanouchi is Tunisia's House Speaker and head of Tunisia's largest political party, Ennahda. He's been recognized worldwide for his role in Tunisia's peaceful transition to democracy following the 2011 Arab Spring in the country. He held a sit-in yesterday calling on Said to respect democracy. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also spoke by phone with the Tunisian president, echoing Ghanouchi's statement. Turkey called for democratic legitimacy to be restored. The UAE and Saudi Arabia remained silent. Police shuttered the local bureau of Al Jazeera television, which then tried to broadcast through cell phones. Reporters Without Borders condemned the move. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Yesterday, we shared the recent report by Council on American-Islamic Relations, which highlighted the spike in anti-Muslim crimes and biases across North America. The author of the report is joining Saleha Farouk for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Saleha.
Thank you very much once again. Today, we're happy to be joined by Robert McCaw, who is Director of Government Affairs at the Council of American Islamic Relations. Robert, thank you so much for your valuable time with us today.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and our pleasure. Now, recently, of course, the Council of American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, released a mid-year report covering anti-bias incidents towards Muslim Americans or Muslims in North America in general. How are the findings in this report any different from the previous one that was released?
Well, what we found to go back, our previous report was actually for 2020, looking back at 2019, we had over 6,000 reports of anti-Muslim bias incidences spanning anywhere from discrimination while traveling at the U.S. border through airports, job discrimination, anti-school bullying, or just on the street harassment or violence. This mid-year report is something that CARE traditionally does not do, but we saw a very large uptick in anti-Muslim bias incidents, acts of violence targeting both Muslims and houses of worship, that we thought it was really important to capture this moment in a mid-year report. It's a short spotlight report. It's 10 pages, but it highlights the fact that CARE in just 2021 has so far received 500 reports to our national office, and that's not including the reports that we're going to be getting from our chapters at the end of the year when we traditionally do our report. But we also then focused on what we found were 38 really significant cases of anti-mosque violence, anti-Muslim intimidation, anti-Muslim hate speech, and acts of violence targeting Muslims in the U.S. We also did a special spotlight that looked at the cases and the uptick of anti-Muslim violence in Canada, which is just north to us. It's on our border. It's where a lot of American Muslims go. And we were just concerned in seeing this uptick that really followed the conflict where Israel bombarded Gaza 2 months ago. So following that, in May and June, we saw this uptick both in the United States and Canada. We sadly saw that terrorist attack that took place in London, Canada, that targeted 3 generations of a Muslim family, killing 4 individuals, injuring a son that was later released. And so we want to capture this moment because when you see such a spike in anti-Muslim hate, You want to collect it all in one place. We saw very much in the media that individual cases were being reported on, but we never saw that this trend itself was being spoken to.
Thank you so much for that insight. You mentioned to this a little bit, but let's get into it. Interestingly, the report highlights how Islamophobia in America somewhat coincides with a recent Israeli assault in parts of Palestine. If you could talk to us about this link and why that was highlighted in the report.
It was highlighted in the report because we actually saw this uptick in anti-Muslim violence as being associated with or inspired by the conflict that took place where Israel was bombarding certain parts of Gaza, or trampling the religious freedoms of worshipers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, or confiscating land. We saw the conflict overseas translate into hostility towards Muslims in the US. Now, some of these attacks actually reference the conflict. Others were just general acts of hostility that occurred either during or after this conflict in May and June. And so, when you see such an international incident take place and then an immediate uptick of violence against Muslims, just as we saw an uptick of violence against members of the Jewish community being targeted by white supremacists and other groups, this is something that we want to document and be a part of this story, just because we didn't believe the media was doing a good job in covering this.
Now, there were approximately 5 key areas that you also alluded to in the anti-Muslim bias incidents mentioned in the report. If you could perhaps briefly tell us about the violent versus non-violent bias incidents and the implications that your organization is trying to challenge right now.
Yeah, so we did really break it down into 5 different areas. We had anti-mosque incidents, and that included acts of hate crimes where mosques were being vandalized, broken into. In one case, there was attempted stabbing of a worshiper at the Dar al-Hijra Mosque in Northern Virginia. And so these were cases that we were focusing in on. There was also what I would say is a threatening incident that was targeting a Palestinian community center, which was being targeted with anti-Muslim hate speech and bomb threats. And again, that was during the conflict where Israel was bombarding Gaza and other places. So what we saw was that there are anti-mosque incidents. There are acts of school bullying. While we documented one physical assault in a school, most of school bullying is actually just verbal threats, harassment, or intimidation. We also have illegal discrimination. So we see, either customers being discriminated against because they're Muslim, or especially quite often Muslim passengers on planes being intimidated by other passengers or by the actual hostesses on the planes. And then we see acts of hate speech where it's, either verbal or written harassment expressing anti-Muslim prejudice, but it doesn't necessarily intimate violence. While during many hate crimes that we documented, that would be associated with hate speech during the crime. So you can see the difference that we'd want to split up hate crimes versus just hate speech. And just out of all these different categories, Islamophobia was the main motivating factor. So this is why it was a report of anti-Muslim bias incidents. And then we broke that down between either being violent or, non-violent.
Let's talk a little bit about the recommendation section. Interestingly, in the report's recommendations, there is mention of Islamophobia against Muslim minorities on a global scale. Have anti-Muslim policies in countries such as India and France, which is what the report mentions, perhaps led to the increase of racism here in North America?
I really think it's an exchange of horrible ideas. And so what we've tracked in India is that its government, the BJP political party running the government in association with the RSS, that they are actually using anti-Muslim conspiracy theories that are being exported by the US by anti-Muslim hate groups, and they're watering them down to fit local narratives. So really, there's an exchange of hateful ideas coming from the US, going into India. We then also see um, anti-Muslim, periodicals, pieces by pro-Hindu vista groups in the U.S. that is taking this language. So really, it is an exchange of really bad ideas that is inciting violence, but it really goes beyond just India. We see China in their policies of repression, torture, genocide, targeting the Uyghurs, that they're using the US's war on terror narratives, and they're using really talking points that the US itself has given up, because I think our own officials had realized the damage and the bias that was being caused by earlier US narratives, but China just keeps it going. We also see in France right now the government using the ideas of cultural war, or a war of ideas, and then introducing anti-Muslim policies that are either dismissing imams, shutting down Islamic NGOs, targeting Muslim private schools. So it's a range of ideas that have an anti-Muslim bias in them, that target Muslims, and they're being expressed in different ways in these different countries. But I really do think there's an interconnectedness between anti-Muslim hate, whether you see it in China, in Burma, in India, France, or how it plays out in places like Israel or Kashmir. A lot of the similar talking points that Muslims are facing in the US or Europe are being exported into other countries, looking for good excuses to target Muslims. And I might add, and this is really important, CARE's mid-year hate crime report coincided with a call from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Jan Schakowsky, joined by 20 other members of Congress, in calling for the State Department to establish a special envoy for monitoring and combating Islamophobia, because the United States really does need to recognize that Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. It's a global threat. It affects the safety of not only Muslims overseas, but in the U.S., and when Muslims in the U.S. travel overseas. And so we are really pushing the United States to adopt a definition of Islamophobia, to create a State Department office to track Islamophobia overseas and offer recommendations on how to curb this hate, which is becoming either violent or repressive in the form of other state policies.
How hopeful are you that any of the additional recommendations concerning, for example, the special envoy that you propose, as well as a change or an increase in anti-hate legislation, will perhaps reverse these bias trends facing Muslims? And if you could talk to us a little bit about those two recommendations in terms of change from a federal level.
Yeah, I think the first easiest step is for when an anti-Muslim bias incident on a large scale occurs, like the one in Canada, or domestically, that President Biden uses his podium, members of Congress, that they denounce these types of acts of violence. We didn't see the administration actually comment on that terrorist attack targeting the family in London, Canada, and we were disappointed as a community by that. But that can easily be addressed just by the government and government officials standing up to condemn these types of violence that are targeting Muslims, and to denormalize it from the last administration. Now, when we're looking at creating a special envoy position, in January, the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations called on the Biden administration to create such a position. CARE, members of USCMO, have been asking for such a position for years. We had a dialogue last week in the Muslim community about, who has been pushing who on this issue for how long, because we have all been working on this. And it's really great to understand how this has been a very large intra-community push. But I was excited because Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Jan Schakowsky, who's a Jewish member of Congress, we had the three Muslim representatives, Omar, Tlaib, Carson, join 7 Jewish members of Congress, Schakowsky, Steve Cohen, Sarah Jacobs, Alan Lowenthal, Mike Levin, Brad Schneiders, and Dean Phillips, with other members of Congress, and asking for this. So this isn't just like a small ask by the Muslim delegation. This is really an intra-faith. This is a very progressive ask. And I think that we can build momentum behind this. We also have reports from Congresswoman Omar that she's going to be introducing legislation on this matter. On that letter to the Biden administration calling for the special envoy position, there were several members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on that letter. I believe that will translate to co-sponsorship of this legislation by members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We are looking to have that introduced and hopefully attached to larger spending bills in that committee or appropriations committees with their support. So I think that this is a real possibility in the next year to 2 years that we could either by legislation mandate a permanent position, or we could compel the Biden administration to create such an envoy position. And I know for a fact that when Biden runs for office again in 2024, he's going to be courting the Muslim community, and the Muslim ban was good, repealing it, but that was just a day one initiative, and he's going to have to show that he's done more for the community. And I guarantee you, if he created this position, it would be a strong signal to the Muslim community. So I just think, politically, strategically, it is in the interest of the Biden administration to, create such a position. Now, as a disclaimer, CARE doesn't support any candidate for office, but, I'm just postulating hypothetically what the Biden administration could do to better win our votes. So I think there's a good political argument to be made for this. I think there's a good legal argument for this to be made. I think it's a real possibility in the next 2 years we could see this happen.
Discussing anti-discrimination and anti-racism efforts today with Robert McCaw, who is Director of Government Affairs at the Council on American Islamic Relations. Robert, in light of the recent report that was released by CARE, thank you so much for your valuable time with us today.
Hey, thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Saleha and Robert. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
According to the U.S. General Frank McKenzie, the United States will continue airstrikes in support of Afghan forces. To discuss this in detail, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. The U.S. has intensified bombing of Afghanistan, and it says it will continue to bomb even after the U.S. withdrawal, which is slated to be the end of August. And refugees are coming out of Afghanistan, and United Nations is warning there are going to be more civilian casualties. To discuss with us is someone who 12 years ago stood up and said, as a Marine and a person with the State Department, that escalation is not right, and he resigned. Our guest is Matthew Ho. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Salam, and thank you for having me back on.
Peace be with you. Matthew is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. In 2009, he resigned his position from the State Department in protest of escalation of war in Afghanistan. So 12 years ago, you resigned. Are you happy with what is going on now? Is it a withdrawal?
Absolutely not. It's such a tragedy. The suffering of the Afghan people has been, going on for more than 40 years now, because this war begins in the late 1970s. What the Americans have been doing there is just the most recent phase. And now, of course, with the Americans leaving, it's moving into another phase as well. I did not think I'd be here in 2009. I did not think I would be 12 years in the future, 2021. One, talking about this still, but I did not think the war would have continued. I really did not think that the United States would be so craven, so desperate, so greedy, for a number of reasons. But to continue the war for this long, and then to see what has occurred so recently, whether it is the very poor structure of the peace deal that Donald Trump made with the Taliban. I mean, that peace deal was really about Donald Trump's ego more than anything else. As well then too, the reaction here in the United States, in the sense that there are so many people who want the war to continue, even though the majority of the American public do not.
Matthew, U.S. has announced they have been bombing Afghanistan, again that is, and the commander of the Afghanistan is saying in Afghanistan that we will continue to do that. What is the purpose of this?
I think you're seeing multiple reasons for this continued bombing. One is that the United States has been allied with the Afghan government and its army and its police for 20 years now. And so you have a connection there. You have relationships. You also have a lot of pressure on the Americans right now coming from within the American political structure. Republicans are very critical of Joe Biden for pulling the troops out of Afghanistan, even though it was Republican Donald Trump who put this plan in place. Very similar to what happened in Iraq, where Barack Obama basically followed George Bush's plan to exit Iraq. But when time came, Republicans forgot about that and criticized Obama. The same thing is happening here. So as well, too, the Taliban have been tremendously successful in their military campaign these last several months. I mean, they have been successful for the last 12 years or so. Every year, the Taliban, even when the United States and NATO forces had nearly 250,000 people in Afghanistan. You had about 140,000 military personnel and 100,000 contractors. Even then, the Taliban every year got stronger. But now I think with the Taliban realizing victory is within their grasp, as well as, too, the other component of that, right? The other side of that is that people within the Afghan government, or people who are supporting the Afghan government, realize that defeat is looming near. So what you're starting to see is various military commanders, various warlords, etc., making deals with the Taliban, basically going over the side. We're seeing army and police units surrender to the Taliban. We're seeing army and police units basically just drop their weapons and walk home. So you're seeing the dissolution, the collapse of the Afghan government.
Matthew, what I'm curious about is what United States could not do with full presence in Afghanistan. Can that be achieved just by bombing here and there?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you might change the outcome of one particular event on one particular day, right? So you may stop the Taliban from overrunning some Afghan army base or police checkpoint, but it doesn't do anything to the overall momentum of the Taliban. And the other problem too is that.
So do you think it's just a favor to some Afghan general or the president? Hey, we are not abandoning you. Actually, we are abandoning you, but we're going to bomb here and there before we leave. What is this? I mean, I have difficulty understanding the logic behind bombing while we are withdrawing and we have a contract agreement with Taliban.
Well, I think we also have to realize that the bombing is going to continue in Afghanistan, just as the bombing continues all throughout the Muslim world where the United States is waging war. I mean, this goes from the west coast of Africa, from the Atlantic coast of Africa, all the way to Pakistan. We've seen recently the Biden administration has launched bombings in Somalia. There are bombings being carried out all the time by U.S. aircraft, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Syria or Iraq, in other, Yemen, where the Saudis are bombing. So whether it's U.S. forces or proxy forces, these bombings are continuous. And so Afghanistan is really falling into they're the last military action in the United States to fall into the way the United States has structured its military operations throughout the Muslim world, where they're relying on proxy forces. So whether it be government forces or local militias, they are utilizing CIA or special operations personnel, and they're using drones as well as then contractors too, to not so much hide American involvement, but keep American involvement to a minimum so that there are hardly any American casualties, so that this is not an issue here in the United States. No one talks about it. However, the people in these countries, including Afghanistan, are bearing the brunt. What we've seen, if anyone has not learned this from the last 20 years, I don't know what else they're going to learn it from, but violence only begets violence. Violence only creates more chaos. Violence only aids extremist groups, on and on and on. And so, yeah, the outcome of these bombings in Afghanistan, it's not going to change anything other than maybe provide some temporary support for the Afghan government, as well as to, save face for the Americans. But there's also this concept within the American military and the CIA and the State Department that in these countries, the United States has to mow the grass. That this goes back to an American outlook, this idea of maintaining American empire, that the Muslim world are borderlands basically that need to be kept down, that these are as many in Washington, D.C. would see, these are the barbarians. And so the grass must be cut continuously. Right? You're always going to have people rising up against the American empire. And so you need to bomb them continuously in order to keep them down. And it's a failed and immoral.
Taliban, which were essentially created by the United States, CIA, and so Pakistani agencies and all of that, we have not declared them to be a terrorist organization. But if after having this peace deal, withdrawing, we keep bombing, don't you think Taliban will use that as an excuse to attack American interests otherwhere? So are we going to make an entity which is not declared terrorist as yet into using terrorist technique to attack the U.S. interest?
Well, this is the very real danger of not just the bombings, but of the wars. People are going to fight back. Nearly every terror attack that I know of that have been staged by some form of international terrorist group in the United States or in Europe or wherever, Australia, the reasons for those attacks are not that these people want other people to convert to their religion, but these attacks are done as revenge for the attacks on their home countries. So when that young man blew himself up at that rock concert in the United Kingdom, when that man shot and killed all those people in the nightclub in Orlando, Florida 5 years ago, when the other person tried to blow up Times Square about 10 years ago or so now, right? I mean, on and on and on, including the 9/11 attacks. These attacks are always said to be done because the United States is bombing countries in the Muslim world. So what you have is and to not understand this is but many in the United States, particularly in Washington, D.C., are like this. It's infantile to think that we, the United States, can go overseas, kill, occupy, invade, et cetera, prop up these despotic and brutal regimes, these corrupt regimes, and think that there won't be a consequence for it. And I'm not saying that these acts of terror are justified, these attacks are justified. However, I'm saying is that they are a logical consequence of American military action. And so to get back to Afghanistan, absolutely. If we continue to bomb Afghanistan, if we continue to support certain elements in Afghanistan, certain parts of the country, certain cliques, certain sects, whatever you want to call them, over other ones, and use violence to do that, there will be continued repercussions. Absolutely. I'm just shocked that there haven't been more attacks on U.S. or European or Australian interests over the last 20 years.
Matthew, Taliban, report is saying that they are controlling borders. They have occupied the border of Tajikistan and Pakistan and China and Iran, more or less. And then the current Afghan government soldiers, they took refuge in Tajikistan, Pakistan, and China, and these places. What happened to all the trainings United States have been doing to the Afghan government forces?
Well, it's this has been for a dozen years or so. The strategy for the United States in Afghanistan has been to build up this 300,000 man Afghan army. The problem is that we built up this army, much like had been done in Iraq, was we built up this army and these security forces. There's a lot of issues with it, but one of the primary issues is that we built it within a kleptocracy. We built it within an incredibly corrupt government, so that the Afghan army and the Afghan police forces from the top down are basically a patronage network. People pay to get positions of power, and then they take from those below them. So what we're seeing here now is this inevitable collapse of that patronage network. What I believe the reason why so many army and police are walking away from their posts and their bases in Afghanistan is because simply their pay has not been arriving. Those who have the money in Kabul see that this may be the last of the money that's going to arrive. They're not certain if the Americans are going to continue to send $4 or $5 billion a year to support the army and the police and other government functions. So they're holding on to the money. That money is not getting out to the police and army. Many of the police and the army simply fight because they need the money for their families. It's about 70% of Afghans live on less than $1 a day. So it's a desperate situation in Afghanistan. So what we're seeing is police and army walking away because they're not receiving their money, as well as, too, the idea of being killed. Particularly, Afghanistan is a very localized country. It's people are very protective of their communities. They identify as Afghans and they have a broader national identity, but the idea of going across the country to die for people over there, I think a lot of people around the world would say, what would be the purpose of that? Why should I do that when I could be at home with my family? So you're seeing that as well too. The idea that what is this for? And the importance of the Taliban seizing the border crossings is simply that the Afghan government cannot survive without those border crossings. Afghanistan, of course, is landlocked. It's more than landlocked. It's very difficult terrain in many areas. So those border areas are very crossing, particularly, say, in the east or the north, where it's mountainous and lots of rivers and such, where you need an actual crossing to get across the border. So by doing that, the Taliban is strangling the Afghan government. And this is something, again, that the Americans should have realized when they were building up and propping up this Afghan government, was that, you were building a house of cards, and inevitably the house of cards will fall. So what we're seeing here is been very predictable.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your time. Truly appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much for that analysis. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on YouTube and Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.